Come with me to a magical place where being labeled the pork queen is a compliment, where being nice is just a way of life, and where all leaders of the free world must pass through. Welcome to Iowa. Whether you're a current Iowan, an Iowa expat, or an Iowan at heart, this show is for you. This is the Iowa Podcast. Real Iowans, real talk, no drama. I'm Justin Brady, and what's in your water? And what's in your air? What's in your land? This is a topic of political discussion, but here's what I'm really glad to kind of know, or here's what I'm glad to see, is that it seems to be less partisan than it used to be. It seems like there's a lot of movement on both sides to come together on these issues, and so today we're joined with Dr. Neil Hamilton. We're going to be talking about the Iowa Nature Summit, of course, but you're also a Drake Law School professor, assistant AG for the Iowa Department of Justice, past president of the American Agricultural Law Association, and past chair of the Iowa Food Policy Council. A lot of food and nature stuff. Welcome to the Iowa Podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Justin. It's a pleasure to be here. I've had a wonderful front row seat on agriculture and food and nature and land and conservation for all my life, really, since growing up on a small farm down in Adams County.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really glad you're in here. The first thing I want to start with is our nature and health. Previously, nature and health, like no connection whatsoever that we knew of, right? Except for there's some ancient wisdom, some older wisdom, but scientifically speaking, we didn't really know the connection. But now we do. So are they more connected than we previously thought?
Well, I guess the best way to answer it is they were always connected.
Of course.
And whether or not we've recognized the dimensions of the connection. And certainly there are more people coming to think about the role that nature plays in their health. And not just nature writ large in the sense that nature is our soil and our water and our air, right? Those various environmental resources, but the opportunity to be out in nature. And I think to some extent, the pandemic maybe helped bring this into a sharper focus for us, because a lot of people spent more time outdoors. Park attendance in Polk County increased somewhat significantly, and so people found a lot of solace and solitude and pleasure and perhaps peace of mind by being outside in nature.
And only recently have I been starting to see studies, maybe in the last couple 2 to 5 years, maybe 5 to 10, time travels quickly, but about, getting out in nature is good for your mental health. So we've been seeing this now, but now we're starting to see, especially in the last 2 months, whether you like RFK or not, this is all of a sudden a big discussion, is like, what are our kids eating? What's in the soil? Is this toxic? Does it harm us? And this is a huge, huge news cycle now. It's like in the news. So is our environment, especially in Iowa with a lot of agriculture, is our environment, is our land kind of getting more toxic than it used to be?
Well, what you see depends on where you sit, and the answer you get to that question depends on who you ask. But certainly there are a number of dimensions of Iowa's land, and we use it as a proxy for nature, that are increasingly stressed by agriculture. Soil erosion, for example. Increased production of corn to help fuel ethanol, wider spread use of pesticides, kind of agrochemicals, large number of livestock, or increasing number of livestock with the wastes that go along with it, and more attention just on that subject, right? That, Iowa has a population, if you consider the animals and you measure the manure and waste they give off, of probably closer to 160 million people as opposed to 3 million. Right? We have a population density of Bangladesh. When you think about the amount of manure that's being produced, most or all of which is actually spread out onto the soil, untreated as our waste would be. And so to the extent that we use nature right? We farm it, we use the water, we use it to dispose of things. It can't help but impact how well it functions.
Right.
And that's why water quality has been a significant issue. That's why I think people are increasingly concerned about why would Iowa have the second highest cancer incident rate in the nation, behind Kentucky, much higher than our neighboring states that are other primarily agricultural states. So nature could use some friends and could use us thinking more, I think, creatively about it. And that's part of what led me to create these nature summits.
Yeah. Is it the pesticides? Like we hear about, the pesticides are getting sprayed. I don't know how many millions of tons. I think you sent over, I was asking a few questions ahead of time.
Yeah.
25 million acres of farmland each year. We're spraying about 2 times, maybe more, with pesticides. And now we're learning that there's a ton of research that shows these pesticides that are sprayed on doesn't go away. It doesn't wash off. It gets into the food. It gets into our blood. It gets into us. And the idea is if it's killing living things, it's eventually going to kill us too. Is this a problem?
Well, again, the answer depends on who you ask. But, historically, we referred to what today we consider as chemicals or pesticides. In fact, the industry loves to call them crop protection products, right? But they were originally known as economic poisons because that's what they do. They kill things. They kill bugs, they kill rodents, they kill weeds. And so, as we're in this competition with pests or weeds or things that would potentially suppress yields, we've looked for kind of a chemical fix. Now, a lot of the chemicals, the pesticides we apply, aren't necessarily directly applied to food, right? And so their ability to show up as a residue in food products can be somewhat more limited. But even there, right, I think people would be surprised to know that folks can use Roundup as a desiccant to actually dry down wheat and oats before they're combined.
Right.
And so that's why it would actually show up, right? When you applied it to the soil to kill the weeds, the wheat wasn't there for it to attach to. You applied it as a desiccant, now we've got a problem. And so I think part of the underlying challenge here is that we've had a fairly cavalier attitude towards these products. And part of that's been our comfort in thinking, well, somebody's looked at them. They've been regulated. They're being used
the
at
FDA
levels
looked at it. Everything's fine.
that are safe.
Yeah.
And we haven't necessarily thought as much about, well, how might they accumulate or how might they interact, right, when you have exposures to a number of different products. And so, anytime we establish a limit, okay, 10 parts per million of nitrates, then that means the water is safe.
Mm-hmm.
And so, okay, well, then we're comfortable at drinking it at 9.9. Well, certainly the waterworks has to get it below 10 to put it into the pipes. If you had a choice, you'd probably just as soon have none or 5 as opposed to 10. And then one of the issues we have, we continue to learn and know more, right? There are many people, cancer researchers, who would look at this issue and say, maybe the rate should be 5 and not 10. But then you immediately think, oh my God, if the rate was 5, how would any of our water systems be able to actually meet a safe drinking water standard? And so part of it also comes down to kind of individual knowledge, and people have different risk levels, are more or less risk adverse, may have alternatives they might seek out. And part of, I hope, and certainly with the cancer issue in Iowa, I've been struck by what appears to be a relative lack of curiosity about why is it happening.
Right.
We love to celebrate the idea that down at Kinnick Stadium, the crowd stands up and waves at the children in the cancer ward. But I also hope we would spend time thinking about why are there so many kids in the cancer ward? And what are we doing to either cause that or what might we do to remediate it?
Yeah, it's and like you said, it's almost a third rail. We're not allowed to talk about that. We're allowed to talk about it in vague terms, but
and there are reasons, I think, both maybe there are practical reasons, or people would just as soon you didn't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not that they know, but they may be afraid of the unknown. And then, part of the reason we may not want to know is because we don't know what would come next. Well, what would we do instead? You mean we can't use these products, or these foods are unsafe? And that's not to say that we're happy necessarily killing ourselves, but at the same time, you would hope we would both be curious and would be willing to trust the science. Because if you look at the history of how technologies have been unfolded, there's typically a dance that happens. Well, the technology is brought on the market. It's used, widely used. Oh my gosh, this is safe. This is safe. Then somebody raises a concern. Well, maybe it's not as safe as we thought.
Right.
Maybe we ought to look at doing something different. The industry says, oh my God, we can't do it without that. Oh, we don't have DDT. We won't have agriculture.
Right, that's true. DDT
But
is a
then
good
over
example.
a while,
Yeah.
then, well, we get rid of DDT. Agriculture continued.
Yep.
We developed a new product. And so, it's maybe only kind of human nature and economic reality that we would defend the things that we use because we're pretty sure they work.
Mm.
And we can lie about them, and not necessarily lie about them, but we can believe in them until at some point we come to not. And you think about smoking in society and how our attitudes, changed about it, and recognition of its potential risk. And I don't think there are many people who would say, well, I'd like to go back to the days when you could smoke on planes and smoke anywhere, and that you didn't have to worry about secondhand smoke, and we'd all be better off. I don't think, we've moved on in terms of our understanding.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, my experience with this was from a chaplain at the National Guard,
Mm-hmm.
and just a friend of mine. And I was saying, yeah, it's weird. When I drink beer, sometimes I get all congested and I feel terrible, but it's random. Like, some beers do it, some beers don't. And he's like, well, is there a pattern? Do you know if it's specific beers? And I'm like, no, it just seems random. He's like, I don't think it's random. And so I ended up, he's like, is it domestic slash imported? So I started paying attention. It's a really long story, but short story is I did okay and just fine with beer created in countries that ban all these like pesticides and all this stuff. But I didn't do okay when it was made here in the United States. Then I would have just my entire sinuses would clog up and like junk running out of my face. I look like an idiot. I look like a psychopath.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of my clue that I can't put my finger on it. I'm not a scientist. I don't know how to do medical research or whatever, but I feel like there's stuff in our food that is not safe, at least for me. And then you hear about people that go over to Europe and they go to France, and we did the same thing. We were over in France eating whatever. I was eating the things that normally kind of give me allergies. I don't have like a dangerous allergy attack or anything, but it's just annoying. And I noticed breads, beers, champagne, that kind of stuff. I could have all that stuff, or I should say white wine, champagne is made in France, blah, blah, blah. And I was fine. And so I was like, now with all these discussions on, hey, we got to stop using all the pesticides. We got to stop. Now it's starting to make more sense to me. So like, now the research is out there. We know these things now. We know they represent a potential risk. And I understand the difficult position people like you are put in, because you can't just start going out there and saying this stuff's unsafe and toxic. We need to end it, because then, multi-billion-dollar companies start suing you into the ground, right? I think this is part of the problem.
Well,
I think this is what one thing people fear. But now that we know they're unsafe, or at least now that there are discussions of them being unsafe, I should say, to clarify, I want to be fair, what are we doing about it?
Well, you've touched on a number of important points, but an underlying one is that that was your personal experience.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you get to make your own personal choices.
Correct.
Because you did some research, or you're making an informed choice. Well, I'm avoiding that because now I'm consuming this. And so that's really, in many ways, you would hope would be one of society's goals, is that, well, people are informed, and then they can make an informed choice. We don't necessarily have to say we have to ban this, or we know enough to say this is toxic, but we do know enough to know that there may be things in it that some people may have difficulty with. And you mentioned the kind of the third rail, or the idea that, well, we can't talk about these things. there's a fair amount of investment in the idea that I just as soon you didn't talk about those things, right?
Yeah,
Or that
yeah.
you didn't think about. And that in many ways, I think, is kind of anti-democratic, small d democratic, in the sense that informed choice and people having information and having choices. As I just taught a food in the law class earlier this morning. And as I told students, I said, hey, you wouldn't go to Baskin Robbins if it said 31 flavors of vanilla, right? We don't go vote if there's not necessarily more than one person on the ballot. Now, you may have vanilla every time you go to Baskin Robbins, but it's still the idea that we like choices,
Right.
and that we make informed choices.
Right.
And so the power of information is important. And, back to, tying this back to nature, part of the idea of a nature summit and the idea of the connection between health and nature is helping people think about the role that nature plays in our lives and how we use it and what more we can be doing to actually support it and make it accessible and make it function so that it provides for us what we hope to get out of it.
I think there's a breakdown when it comes to us talking about like saving nature, helping nature enjoy. I think people don't know what to do. They're like, we're surrounded by, like, I go on bike trails, and I do I go on hiking. Like, what, Dr. Hamilton, what exactly do you want me to do about it? And what's the problem? And so, like, one of the things that you've talked about is, like, let's start at the soil erosion, right? Like, what does that even mean? And how can we control soil erosion? Isn't that just kind of a natural thing that's just going to happen?
Ooh, well, not necessarily. I mean, you certainly don't get the same soil loss coming off a grassland hillside that you might off of a cornfield planted up and down the road.
Yeah.
And so there are ways in terms of education, helping provide financial support and incentives for people to put in conservation practices. But one of the first things you have to do to deal with it is to recognize that it's an issue, right? That it's something we need to be thinking about, because, if we aren't taking care of the soil, both quantity, which is what we've talked about with erosion, but also soil health, which is an issue that we haven't thought as much about, the living things that are in the soil, the things that make it fertile and make it store carbon and make it store more water. And so getting people to actually recognize those and think about them and what are the practices that we can do. What can, you aren't a farmer, and so maybe you don't have a lot that you can do directly on soil conservation other than supporting public policy that would help make it a priority and provide, funding for it. But you mentioned a couple other ways that you use nature. You go on bike trails. You like to go hiking. I've been on the board of the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation for over 30 years, and we've had our fingers on most of the bike trails that have been created in the state, right? Saving abandoned rail corridors, holding on to them, helping convey them to the county governments and others are putting in the trails, helping obtain the funding, whether it's public funding through the REAP program or federal transportation money. And even as a voter, for example, here in Polk County, in the last number of years, there's been two different bond issues, right? The Polk County Land and Water Fund, we just approved $65 million in, a bond issue paid for with property taxes to be used for conservation. There's one on the ballot in Story County this fall, right? A $25 million bond issue to provide local funding to add trails, to deal with water quality, to add more public land. Right? You think about if you like to hike, you wouldn't mind if there were more opportunities to, right? Or if there were more corridors. We have these wonderful linear corridors in our state, our rivers and streams, but most of them don't necessarily have trail systems along them.
Yeah.
But they could, right, in certain places. So, voting for nature, voting for people who support nature. One of the projects that we're going to do at the Nature Summit next week is I've prepared a number of postcards. They're the Iowa Nature Summit, but they say vote for nature. And we're going to hand out a packet of postcards to everybody with some of them already stamped, some of them with labels already for officials like the governor and other legislative leaders, that nature itself isn't inherently partisan.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
We can turn it into partisan issues, right? Oh my gosh,
we can turn anything into a partisan issue.
Are we going to raise the sales tax to fund I Will, for example? But 14 years ago, the Iowa voters passed a constitutional amendment to dedicate the next 3/8 cents of the sales tax to a dedicated fund for soil conservation, water quality, public lands, trails, nature education, and we haven't put a penny into it. And at some point, if we ever raise the sales tax again, the first 3/8 cents is going to be cut off and actually put into this dedicated fund. Other states around us, Minnesota being a good example, has a state land and water fund that funds all types of education and natural resource improvement. There's more we could be doing. And go ahead.
No, go. I just want you
and
to
I
complete
think part
the idea
of the
there,
value of getting people to come together to think about nature is then when they say, well, what can I do? What are the things that our state could be doing that we're not doing now? Adding more public land, providing local funding, providing state funding, getting out and using nature, letting politicians and your civic leaders know that you enjoy these resources and that you want to have them. Because the more we're out and using them, then the more we either recognize the value they provide to it.
Right.
Or we recognize how they may be compromised. And you say, well, geez, I was out today and I was surprised at how dirty the water was or the land that was being plowed up. And it looks like we're bulldozing every tree in the Waukee area, right, to put in a new housing development on some of the most fertile land in the world.
We have we have this running joke when my wife and I are running errands.
Yeah.
And it's always when we get to certain areas, I'm not going to call any cities out at all.
I live near Waukee, so you can call it out if you want to.
When we get to certain high development areas, our running joke is, hey, you missed a couple trees over there, you better go tear them up, because they just bulldoze everything.
And then they put in houses and plant 10-foot tall trees and hope at some point this is going to look like a neighborhood.
I'm like, I don't mind you guys putting in houses. That's fine. But why do we just have to bulldoze everything flat to do it? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
How hard would it have been to build around those?
I know.
And that's what I'm
so
talking
true.
about. And that,
I want to get to soil health, though.
Why couldn't we actually think more about nature in our land use planning and in development?
Because it looks better. Neighborhoods with cool trees sell better, I would imagine.
I would think.
I'm not an expert, but I have architect buddies, So, I want to talk about soil health. You talked about, not everybody can be a farmer, blah, blah, but obviously farmers, I would imagine, do have a lot of control over soil health. And is soil health, like the nutrients in the soil, they get pulled up into the plants we eat. Is it true that the produce we're eating has less nutrition in it than it used to? Because I'm hearing there's more, medical people out of Stanford are suggesting, hey, maybe you should be supplementing with magnesium and trace minerals, etc., because our food isn't as nutritious as it used to be. Is this a thing that's happening?
Well, there's certainly, people that would believe that sick soil or poor quality soil produces poor quality produce in terms of the nutrients that are there. I mean, if they weren't in the soil for the plant to pull up, and micronutrients are the ones that you mentioned, it's intuitive that would in fact be the case. And there's research that would indicate that the protein content of corn has gone down as we've increased its productivity, we're pumping more into it in terms of the carbohydrate part. And so is it something we should think more about? Yes, probably is. Is it something that even if I wanted to know more about it, I'd have trouble finding the information, deciding what to do? I think it's fair to say that the mainstream agricultural community might look at people and say, you know what, your degraded soil is producing degraded food, and they'd say, well, you're a kook. right?
Yeah.
Where did you come up with that idea, right? That there's things I can do with how the land is sown. One of the sessions that we have at the Nature Summit is on this very issue, though, about the connection between soil health and fertility and food quality. And it's also part of the larger session about the role of nature in public health, because you can't divorce our health from what we eat. And you can't necessarily divorce what we eat from how we raise it and the soil and the practices we use for it. You know, this class that I talked about teaching this morning, you know, one of the comments that I make is that I think that we've kind of have entered into a better food period, right?
What does that mean?
Well, that's the point, right? I mean, it's better to whatever is better to you, right? I mean, people go to the farmer's market. They don't go there because the grocery store is closed,
right?
Or the shelves are empty. But there's something about what they're getting. Is it the quality of the food? Is it the connection with the producer? Is it knowing the money spent locally? Is it being able to ask how it was raised, that comfort level in it? And so in that regard, it's better for them. Maybe what you're better is, well, I want to drink organic milk, or I like cage-free eggs, or I like heirloom vegetables.
Right.
Right? And so, again, back to my comment about kind of food democracy and the whole idea that people like choices and people like to make informed choices. And nature and how we use it plays an important role in this. But it requires us, right? The longest distance that people sometimes have to travel to change is the 5 or 6 inches between their ears. And how they think about something. And there are a lot of reasons why, well, I don't want to think about this. I don't want to worry about, oh my God, I got to go to the farmer's market. I have to get, I want to be comfortable that my food's safe. And our food is relatively safe. That's the whole function of our food regulatory system, right? That it's safe. Could it be safer? Perhaps. Could it be better or more satisfying? For some people, certainly. And that's one of the reasons you see a proliferation of alternative foods and different ideas about diet. And connecting it back to our health, though, is a link that we're increasingly making.
So, like, I don't know if you saw I think it was the American Health Roundtable, something like that. Had like Casey Means, RFK. It had a lot of health, Dr. Marty McCary, Johns Hopkins. It had a couple other people, more like bloggers, and they seem to indicate it's a lot more pressing. So, and they use stronger language than we're using in here. And again, I'm not an expert. This is a roundtable opinion. It's 4 hours on YouTube if y'all want to bear
Somebody
through that.
sent me a link to it and asked me if I'd watched it. I hadn't.
It's not exactly softball. They're not softballing these questions. They're naming companies. They're being aggressive. They're saying things like pesticides are getting into your food supply and they are poisoning you. It's like the most aggressive thing I've seen. Like I've seen studies, I've seen people kind of talk about this a little bit, but it's always coded language. They're always careful what they say, but none of these people were careful at all. So do you generally agree with the opinions that you're hearing on how the food, on how what we're growing is dangerous? Or are you a little bit more, okay, let's hold on. It's definitely something we need to look at, but I wouldn't go that far to say it's poisoning us. Where do you sit? Just your own personal opinion.
Well, I sit on the side that it's something we should be concerned about, and that we need to study more, and that we need to have options in terms of the choices that we make. I don't think it's poisoning us. We have to hope that it isn't. You hope we're not doing this kind of large-scale feeding trial on the American population. Now, having said that...
Which is what they're suggesting.
Now, having said that, there are certainly reasons why we should be concerned about the increased incidence of disease.
Oh, and the cancer rates like you indicated.
Well, there are cancer rates, or autism, for example, right? That there's something or some things happening in the way we organize ourselves and the products we use. And I'm sure I didn't see the roundtable you're talking about, but I imagine they probably said, we're basically swimming in a sea of chemicals. And whether it's what we put on our yards or what we spray on our food or what's in our carpet or in our dry cleaning or just, they're unavoidable. And it's back to my comment about that we've had a fairly cavalier attitude towards the risk with these products. And that part of that attitude is a function of the fact we maybe would just as soon not have one more thing to worry about.
Yeah,
and
there's definitely that.
And that if I really don't have a good option, what are you going to tell me I need to do next?
Right.
And I can't imagine, and again, not having seen it, they were probably long on worries and relatively short on answers or alternatives. In terms of,
some of the things,
as a result.
And I'll ask you about the alternative with just the last few, the last minute. We're a little over, but I'm really happy you're in here.
Well, I'm happy
It's
to
a
be
really
here.
important topic. And like some of the solutions they do talk about is, and we'll have to keep this short, but we're like organic, non-GMO, regenerative farming is a term that they threw around a lot.
Nobody defined, but
no one defines it.
They define it.
And so are these, just the last minute, are these noble causes worth pursuing here in Iowa?
Well, certainly we have a growing organic sector, right? And organics is a way, if you were as a consumer and you wanted to know how can I buy a food product in which there hasn't been any chemicals used intentionally in its production, organics one of the few ways that you could actually do that. Is it safer for you? Well, again, you're saying it is. The USDA is never going to tell you it's safer, because for them to say the organic is safer means that the other stuff is unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
And the other stuff is all the other food that we raise that is in fact legal to sell. So they view it as a choice. And so there are certainly things that individual consumers can do to try to reduce their risk profile. And trying to support more research and information about it is one. But there's a fair amount of alarmism. Oh my God, it sells magazines, or maybe it generates votes. If nothing else, we need to use our heads and open our eyes and look for the source of the information too, and trust science. I mean, my gosh, when you think about what we went through in the last 4 or 5 years, we wouldn't even trust the science on whether or not we had a way to deal with a pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not we should use vaccines and whether vaccines are safe. And
it's a debate that rages on.
It's still today.
Yeah.
And so maybe the conclusion there is you're never going to have the answer or complete agreement.
And that's like a really good place to leave it, is that science is a pursuit of the answers. And what always kind of grinds my gears is when one side or the other always says the science is on our side. I'm like, science doesn't take sides, guys. It's a constant pursuit. The best way you can pursue science is by staying humble and always looking for answers and not claiming that you know the answers.
And denying other people's science, right, is something that they don't know what they're talking about.
Right.
That's bad science. Well,
absolutely.
It's
Couldn't
not my
agree more.
science.
Dr. Neil Hamilton, how do people find out about the Iowa Nature Summit, and what's the date?
Well, the dates are October 9th and 10th. It's at Olmsted, and the easiest way to find out about it is to go to iowanature.org. That's our website. Registration's open. If you're a student and you're interested in a scholarship, there's a button you can touch to apply for a scholarship. We have about 200 people registered. We have room for some more. And so iowanature.org.
Excellent. Dr. Hamilton, thank you so much
You're
for
welcome.
coming on the Iowa
And I'm not
podcast.
really a doctor. I only play one on TV interviews, right? Professor works fine for me. Okay.
Oh, did I mislabel you?
Well, yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm so sorry, Professor Hamilton.
They're giving me Iowa State every time I go there to do anything. It's always Dr. Hamilton. I said, well, go ahead and give me one of these degrees then. You want to call me a doctor, right? But,
well, I'm sorry about getting that
that's okay.
wrong, but I guess
That's okay.
But Professor Hamilton, thanks so much for coming on the show.
You're welcome.
And to my fellow Iowans, Iowa expats, and Iowans at heart, thanks for listening and subscribing to the Iowa Podcast.